Today I want to discuss fashion history and fashion forecasting, and why they're important when you're creating a society to help you tell your narrative. Hi friends, I'm Samantha Rei. Welcome to Cinema Attire. This is your future. How will you dress it? For those of you who are new to the channel, this is a series where I'm going to be doing a critical breakdown of science fiction and futuristic movies and film through the point of view of a fashion designer, and I do have a little bit of experience having been a designer for the last 20 years and a big geek. So we're going to talk about fashion history first. Fashion history, the way it's known currently, didn't actually come into existence until the late 1800s, but for ease of talking about the subject, I'm going to use it for historical clothing as well, because there were trends. Even though they didn't change as often, they did change. And one of the biggest parts of fashion is the change in trends. And also, to kind of keep this short, I'm only going to be going back about 800 years, because when you look at historical costuming in movies and TV, those are usually the stories that get told. And of course, there are ones that go back further, like ancient Egypt, etc. But for the most part, we see medieval, Renaissance, Rococo, colonial, the 1920s, etc. These stories that we're familiar with usually happen over the course of about 800 years. Now, one thing I'm not going to talk about in this one, because I plan on talking about it in the future, trends come and go, especially in fashion. Trends also come and go in hair and makeup, specifically eyebrows. I don't have the time to talk about it today. You can't make me, because I'll get a little heated and I'll get distracted from the fashion. So we'll get to it in a future episode, I promise. One thing to think about when you are looking at historical costume and thinking that it looks really realistic, a lot of costume designers do have that fashion history background. And sometimes they actually bring in textile experts, historical experts to assist the costumers, but they're not going to spend that time or money if they're just making a popcorn flick like Clash of the Titans or other Clash of the Titans. To begin with, the easiest way to tell what era something comes from is silhouette. If you look at something that's very strictly medieval, the way you think of medieval, it's going to look very different from something that's Renaissance in the way that you think Renaissance is. But because we have so much kind of fantasy, or people sort of playing fast and loose with back then, talking about, I don't know, things like The Witcher or Princess Bride, where it's a pretend place, you have this kind of amalgamation of the two. So you could have something that was worn in the 500s that's then also being worn in like the 1400s, and they wouldn't necessarily exist at the same time, but a lot of times designers will like push those things together to give you this otherworldly historical sort of feeling to things. One example I want to talk about is in the Middle Ages, which took place between 400 and 1400s. They wore a lot of layered, drapey, kind of A-line things, a lot of shirts, over dresses, shawl type things over undergarments that would be like a chemise, and women would belt it. But for the most part, it was the same silhouette. The people who were the aristocracy, the people who were royalty, they would have obviously nicer versions of those things with more sumptuous fabrics and decadent colors. And peasants would have things that were more homespun. And I mean, this brings up a point. There was this thing called sumptuary laws. There were textiles, colors, and silhouettes that rich people and people in charge could wear, and poor people were not allowed to wear those things. So you can easily tell looking at a painting or an a garment that's been found from different eras, who may have owned it based on what it's made of, what the embroidery is on it, what color it came in. While you had those same kind of rules during the Renaissance era, which again overlaps with medieval times, the silhouettes of the garments started to get more ostentatious for royalty, rich people. We had different shapes of bodices, exaggerating of the women's shape, different types of tops that men would be wearing, more and exaggerated jewelry and headpieces. So here I want to show you a couple of comparisons between what would generally be considered something that's medieval and generally something that would be considered Renaissance. And I do want to talk about the fact that there were other things happening in the world at the same time. Obviously, there were things happening in Asia. There were all kinds of interesting trends. It is important for me to state here that I plan on talking about Africa in a later video. Africa is not a monolith. It is a collection of very diverse countries that all had their own different style and cultural clothing, and they had a very different film industry than we have in the US. So I want to be able to give it the respect and thought it deserves, but I don't want to make this without pointing out the fact that there were other people in the world at the time wearing things that were not these things. As we get closer to the modern era, we see the timelines start to get a little bit shorter in between each trend. So we have medieval, which was this huge span of time, Renaissance, which was a shorter span of time. We have colonial, Rococo, Baroque, which was an even smaller amount of time. Then we get to the Industrial Revolution, and from, well, there are two industrial revolutions, but we're going to talk about the one that really made fabric manufacturing and clothing manufacturing quicker and easily accessible. So from there forward, trends had a much smaller shelf life, and because trade was happening a lot more rapidly, we saw trends come and go a lot more quickly. So going back a couple hundred years, we do see once trade routes became more accessible to people, other countries would take trends that they didn't quite understand and incorporate them into what they were wearing. So people in Europe would take what people in Japan and China were wearing and incorporate, whether it be the fabrics or the embroidery techniques, into what they were wearing, and vice versa. We see a lot of that now, even, especially with the advent of the internet. It's just kind of more subtle, since most of the things that are happening are street fashion, whereas with them, it was the aristocracy. And with us, it's more accessible. So lower to middle class can do it, and the rich can do it, but everyone can do it. And what's interesting now, especially the way fashion works, and this is going to go into the next section, everything is so accessible that you see a trend come and go in the blink of an eye. Especially in the last 5 years, fashion is at a place that it hasn't been even in the last 20 years. Fashion has changed so dramatically that we have offshoots of offshoots of offshoots of things, and the adherence to those things, they can tell it just by a look, even if the layman thinks that it looks the same. And that's the kind of nuance that you need to take into account when you are doing something that takes place even 10 years ago, 10 years in the future. How fast were things moving 10 years ago versus how fast are they going to move 10 years in the future? So before we finish up with fashion history, I want to kind of give you some comparisons of movies that maybe did it really well, movies that did it kind of bad, and a couple other little categories. So here are some examples of some good historical fashion. Here are some examples of not great historical fashion. Here are some examples of some that were so close, but either they had the wrong textiles, the wrong undergarments, or parts of it were the wrong era, but not on purpose. There are certain costume designers that play with the timeline purposefully, such as Colleen Atwood. She does a lot of these historical costumes, but she will purposely do something that's either older or out of the timeline to prove a point about the character or to draw your eye to the character. Here are some examples of subtly playing with the timeline. Hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what to look for when you're watching historical movies, or even movies that are fantasy based and you want to understand why they made those choices. Now we're going to talk about fashion forecasting. It's essentially studying where fashion was, where fashion is, where it's going, and where it can go. It's how people predict trends, and while they're not always 100% on the mark, which is why we see things going on clearance that people absolutely thought would sell, it really does kind of help to figure out where the consumer's minds are going. And it's an important thing to think about when you're trying to build a futuristic world. Fashion forecasters generally look at what has been popular recently and where the next inevitable step is. A lot of times they look at street fashion, especially alternative street fashion, to see kind of where the more creative types are headed. Which is why a lot of times you'll see kind of subculture fashion sneak into mainstream fashion. It's why we've seen goth trends and punk trends in mainstream fashion. Like I discussed before, fashion has evolved a lot in the last even 20 years, but it hasn't evolved as rapidly as it has in the last 5, with the boom of fast fashion and then subsequent trying to go back to slow and indie fashion. We've seen vast amounts of trends come and go in ways that people could not have predicted. And one of the reasons why people are kind of going back to slow fashion, like slash indie designers, is they know that they can get the thing that they want more quickly. Those are the people that are kind of veering away from fashion shows and going more towards same season fulfillment. I, as a fashion designer, mostly do custom garments. I mostly do high-end special occasion wear. I do also do street fashion, but my customers come to me because they know I can make something that's going to fit them in the vein of what message they're trying to send. And since more and more people are realizing where clothing comes from and they want to stop supporting these big companies that don't necessarily treat their employees well, and then also on top of it get something that fits them right, we're just seeing this amazing return to people having a full say in what they wear and how it's made. Even if you don't work for a big fashion house, it's incredibly important to understand where your client might be headed. Let's say if string bikinis are in this season and you're a swimwear designer and you make nothing but like plain one-piece swimsuits, you're probably not going to sell a ton of them, because the people who are going to be wanting the swimsuits are going to be buying them for spring break and summer. If you want to reach the most amount of clients, you want to make sure that you're making the thing that the most amount of people are going to wear. So it's important to do that research. It's a little bit easier if you're an indie designer, because you can just kind of figure out what your client base is into, but that also takes studying your client base. One of the important reasons to understand where fashion has been is specifically so you know that the property you are creating is going to be popular with the masses. Something like Mad Men, they put a lot of thought into the costuming in that show, and you could see how that was reflected in mainstream culture, because for pretty much the entire run of that show, it was easy to access 50s and 60s fashion, and you saw this uptick in mainstream fashion being influenced by retro style. You also see things like American Horror Story, especially Coven, Sabrina on Netflix, even things like The Great Gatsby and Peggy Carter and Ms. Fisher. Those things being either historical or influenced by historical fashion then made those styles come back into style. A lot of people see good costuming and want to emulate it because it's not necessarily something that we have right now. It's brilliant. One of the reasons that it's so important to understand forecasting when you're creating futuristic costumes is if you're looking 10 years in the future, you have to think about, why did it go from where we are now to 10 years in the future? Why did it go from where we are now to 25 years in the future, 100 years in the future? What's happened? Has there been a war? Has there been a disaster? Is it not about fashion anymore and it's literally just about wearing what you scavenged? Is it a utopia? Can you have anything you want? Can you get any sort of fabric in any color that you could dream of and have it be affordable and everyone can have what they want? Why is that the case? If you are on a spaceship and you're wearing a uniform, why are you wearing a uniform? Are you military? Are you custodial staff? What is your uniform's purpose? What is it made out of? What textiles do you have access to? Did you colonize another planet? Do they have those natural textiles there? Where did you get those textiles? Are you using purely tech fabric? And I know some people don't quite understand tech fabric, but it's man-made fabric that's, made using science to serve specific purposes. And I see a lot of kind of post-apocalyptic things where that wouldn't necessarily still exist, using tech fabrics instead of scavenged things or reweaving natural fibers. One property I do want to talk about that did a good job but didn't quite push it far enough, in my opinion, is the Hunger Games. They were so close, and with the Capitol, it absolutely makes sense that they are a society of bread and circuses. They want a nice distraction. It's very easy to distract people if they have easily accessible high fashion clothing, and dressing yourself is something to keep people sedated, essentially. And then each different district had a certain kind of clothing, but oftentimes that clothing didn't necessarily make sense for what their export was. And they were very close. Some of them were, but a lot of them didn't quite make sense if you paid attention to what they were exporting. That would be an instance where you would want to figure out, if that person is working from morning till night, are they really going to have a lot of casual clothing, even if it looks poor, it looks peasant-y? Or are they the kind of society that's probably going to spend all of their time just in the clothes that they wear and then wash it and go to bed and wake up the next day and put it back on. An example that I think is good, and I know I'm probably gonna get a lot of side eyes for this. As someone who did not like Dune, I thought that the costumes were really good because none of them looked like anything that exists now. None of them look like a single thing that you could imagine right now. There were absolutely essences of things with the royalty military, but it doesn't look like anything that has exactly existed. And that, to me, makes sense if you are going to be putting something that far in the future. You have to think about the different things that have happened between now and then, and why it didn't carry over. Here are some examples of some futuristic costuming that I think is very good. Here are some examples of some costumes that I do not think did a good job. Here are some that were close, but I think they just needed to push it a little bit farther. Now to ask you, what movies or series do you think did a really good job of figuring out how to tell the story with the costumes? Now that you know a little bit more about forecasting, which movies or TV do you think could have done a little bit better with a little more research? Thank you for joining me for this episode of Cinematire. This was a really fun one for me because I really like to teach, and I hope what I gave you was informative and helps you build your narrative. If you like this episode, please like this episode. Please comment, subscribe, and if you want to see behind the scenes stuff, please subscribe to my Patreon. Link is in the description. See you next time.